This is Tamron 50-400, which I put through its paces on 3 football games, soccer for US viewers. So I'd say I got some practice with it to do the review. There won't be any charts or Loca test, just nitty-gritty for what it is made for. The lens is a rental for which I paid with my own money, so I guess it will be the most honest review possible. I'm not obliged to say anything good about this lens, since I paid $80 to have it for 4 days. I used this lens to shoot some random stuff first to get used to it, and then went to 3 soccer games for the real stuff. I have driven 140 miles to get there. It was raining and snowing, so you need to give me a like already for my dedication. The games I photographed are one of the lowest tier leagues you can get here in Poland. They are kinda professional, players are paid to play, but some aspects seems to be really amateur. For example, the venues, fields the teams play sometimes are full of crap because the team share their field with other sports teams, and sometimes their field is a training field for the higher league club. So usually there are training goals all over the place. There were archery targets all around on one of the fields. Sometimes there is a parking lot just behind the field, so when you photograph towards the goal, the background is really nasty. And these fields are usually cramped up and small, so it is actually harder to shoot photos there, since there is not much separation between the field and the stands, if stands are even there. On the professional field, you have at least 20 to 30 meters separation between the field and the stands. Here, sometimes there is a fence 1 meter behind the sideline. So, not the best condition to shoot photos there. Actually, if you plan to shoot in better conditions, you might get much better results with this lens. And I'm not a professional photographer, although I already shot some basketball games and 10 plus soccer games, usually getting 10 to 15 really good photos from each session. So, treat this with a grain of salt, because in some situations the problem might be the photographer, myself, and the actual conditions on the field, cramped and full of crap. I used the newest firmware, the one which fixes the autofocus V2. And what are the pros of this lens? It is light, weighs 1155 grams, it is not that big, 18 centimeters when collapsed, a bit longer when extended. So really similar size than 70-200 F2.8 GM2, even shorter when collapsed. It is also kinda cheap. Sigma 100-400 is a bit cheaper, but Sony is 2.5 times more expensive. The reach 50-400, 50mm is very useful when the game starts and there is a team's presentation, but it depends on the field and the position where the players used to stand during that ceremony, because sometimes even 50mm is too tight, although you can get at least officials and the captains into the frame when you are standing on the sideline. Usually you can get each team too, but not both teams. It is definitely a much better option than the lens that start at 100 or 150mm. And regarding the 400mm, it's not enough to reach the farther goal and have enough details. And also at F6.3, you won't get enough separation, at least in case of the venues I've been to, because there was stuff just behind the goal. For comparison, 70-200 usually gives you the ability to reach half of the court. It also depends on the size of the field, because they vary. GM2 might not be enough for the real deal field to reach the half. Anyway, 50-400 seems like a very good range for soccer, baseball, rugby or American football. During the first game I used either zone autofocus or large sport autofocus. I missed some shots, but I usually use this mode before with my A7 IV and 70-200 F2.8 GM2 or Sigma 150-600 EF adapted via MC11, in both cases successfully. With the Tamron I was not that successful, but this was my first game this spring. Last game I shot was in autumn last year, so 4 months ago. So it might have been my fault, not the lens. Sometimes with zone autofocus, the camera decided to autofocus on the background instead of the players, which are much closer. Guess because the objects in the background were either more contrasty or got more defined shapes. For the second and the third game, I switched to tracking with the zone tracking and large spot tracking, and it worked much better. Much higher rate of shots in focus, but still some shots either missed focus completely or focus on the wrong target, for example, player in the background. Still, it might have been my fault. Hard to say. Generally, tracking with this lens seems to be on par with 70-200 GM2. Is autofocus good with this lens? I say yes. It is maybe a bit less snappy than with 70-200, but not much. Tracking has worked really well. Can you get enough separation with 50-400 F4.5-F6.3? Yes and no. Some shots are quite good in that regard, but it's when your subject is much closer to you than to the background. Usual stuff. Lately, Lightroom introduced an artificial autofocus module, so you can actually create bokeh artificially, but in camera you can create good separation with this lens if the conditions are right. Of course, 70-200 f2.8 is much better in that regard, but half the reach. Also, having a custom switch and USB port is a really nice thing for this lens. I've been able to program custom focus ranges into the lens, and I've been using them during the games. Although I have also used full range autofocus and never missed the photo due to the close focus, only to the long one. You can program a lot of functions to the custom switch and custom button, and you do not need any docking station. That's the big plus. And one more important thing, the second game I photographed started at 3:30 p.m. Sunset was supposed to happen at about 5:50 p.m, but the weather broke loose. So the clouds got really dark and it got really gloomy during the second half of the game. I planned to shoot with the 70-200 last 20 minutes of that game, but actually the conditions got so dark that I had to switch from 50-400 because ISO levels went to 10,000 and above. I'm shooting manual mode with shutter speed of 1,000 of the second or higher, and I even tried to lower the shutter speed to 1/16400, but it was still not enough. So if you plan to shoot during the evenings on the fields without artificial lights, this lens is not the best choice. I actually rented this to check if this lens is okay for shooting sports before I buy it, and I have a bit of mixed feelings. I guess for professional fields it would be just fine, but for the fields I usually shoot on, it is sometimes problematic due to the busy backgrounds. Maybe I would be better off getting a 1.4x teleconverter for my 70-200, making it 98-280 f4. 280mm should be enough even on a bigger soccer fields, but of course 400mm is nice to have. Also, this 50mm is really need to have, because you can actually get away just having this one lens for every shot on a soccer, rugby or American football field. I'm lucky to have 70-200 GM2, but if you are on a budget, this Tamron is definitely one of the best options to buy. I will probably also check Sony's 100-400 F4.5-F6, but it is actually out of my reach financially at the moment. I just don't want to rush the decision. Tamron is a really good option in my opinion, but I would like to check the other one and maybe the teleconverter if I can find a used one cheap, because new one cost almost 2/3 of the price of this Tamron. Of course, I shot some photos on 70-200 during each game, and I like this lens more for the background separation, but with A7 IV I missed some shots too. And during the first game, autofocus actually got stuck with 70-200. Seems like it was only able to autofocus between minimum and 10 meters and wouldn't allow to focus farther. but it was at the end of the game, so it didn't matter that much. I guess the camera restart helped because it never happened again. And yes, autofocus range toggle has been on full, and actual limiter is 3 meters to infinity. So regarding autofocus, a part of the situation I just described, seems Tamron is on par with GM2, maybe like 5% less shots in focus on Tamron, but I haven't counted them, just reviewed each session. So for the Tamron 50-400, is it an ideal lens for soccer, baseball, football and rugby photography? No. Is it really good for these sports? Kinda. Depends mostly on the field and its surroundings. Is it enough for these sports? Definitely. Sure, two Canon bodies with their 24-105 f2.8 and 120-300 f2.8 will be much better, but the price difference for 120 to 300 alone is 12 times more than this Tamron. So if you are on the budget, this seems to be the best lens for shooting sports playing on the big fields for Sony E-mount. I plan to shoot some wildlife too, but due to the bad weather I wasn't able to do so, but I know it would be okay for shots from the height and not so much too short for the walking in photos. It might be okay on the high resolution body in APS-C mode like A1, A7 IV or A7 V for walking in scenarios. And another pro of this lens is macro reproduction. It is 1:2 on the short end and 1:4 on the long end. At 50mm you basically touch your subject with the lens, so you have to be cautious not to break the front element. But if you think about macro photos mostly, there are other lighter options with higher magnification, but it is for sure a big plus of this lens. Will I buy it? Probably. I'm 70-30, I would do it next 3 to 6 months, but it's kinda dependent on my finance and I have some priorities over the telephoto lens. I will also try to test Sony 100-400 too and see if almost 3 times the price makes any sense. I doubt it. I'm glad I tested the Tamron, so I have a clear understanding of its potential. Definitely the range 50-400 is a really good fit. Autofocus and tracking are also really good. My only concern is speed, f-stops of this lens, but other options in my budget are not faster. Sony is just 0.3 EV faster and all f2.8 glass is just out of my reach. So for me it's either this lens or 1.4x teleconverter for 70-200 f2.8 I already own. If you do not have this second option, Tamron seems to be the best choice for E-mount for sports played on big fields like soccer, football, rugby or baseball. I guess hockey, track and field, horse riding, etc. too. Hope it helps and cheers mate!